Okay, everyone, so we're going to be talking about 7.5, unresolved tensions after World War One. I know in my previous video for 7.4, I think I mislabeled it. 7.4 is the economy in the interwar period. I believe I called it unresolved tensions after World War One, which you could still technically say it is, but according to the College Board and your CED, 7.5 is entitled Unresolved Tensions After World War One. So, thematic focus for this subtopic is governance. That includes political systems, empires, nations, revolutions, military, some questions to put in your notes. Who has the power? How did they get it? How is the power distributed and enforced? So that's under governance. So contextualizing the unit, again, you're welcome to pause the video here and look over this. I go into it in detail in the video over 7.1. So Qing Dynasty in China is going to transform to the Republic of China in 1911. Tsarist Russia is going to transform into the USSR by 1917. And the Ottomans are going to transform into Turkey in 1923. So essential question is, in what ways did territorial possessions by imperialist states continue from before 1900? And in what ways did these territorial possessions change after 1900? So imperialism is going to continue to happen even after World War I. A lot of colonized peoples had fought in World War I for their parent countries. They had hoped this sacrifice would win them more respect in the eyes of their colonizers. Some had even been promised independence if they would fight in World War I. And for the most part, none of them would get that. It would be another unfulfilled promise. This would lead to the brewing and uprising of rebellions within colonized areas of Africa and South Asia, so in India. Imperialism had essentially continued into the 19th century past World War I and changed due to World War I. Many colonized peoples began seeking their independence after World War I, such as Africa and India. After the war, the Great War, many areas in Eastern Europe had been granted their independence, but many areas in Africa and South Asia had not. So, key concept for this one, just one key concept. Between the two world wars, Western and Japanese imperial states predominantly maintained control over colonial holdings. In some cases, they gained additional territories through conquest or treaty settlement, and in other cases, faced anti-imperial resistance. So beginning in the late 1800s, Japan had started encroaching into Korea. By 1910, Japan had complete control of Korea. Of course, the Koreans weren't pleased with being ruled over by the Japanese. And by the end of World War I, Japan was seeking support from Europe, actually, to colonize even further into the Asian continent. At the end of World War I, in 1919, the Korean emperor suddenly dies, and a large conspiracy is that the Japanese poisoned him. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. So enter the March 1st movement, which was a series of Korean demonstrations where millions of Koreans gathered in the streets to protest Japanese imperialism. As one might expect, these demonstrations were put down violently by the Japanese government. So, let's jump to China, where shortly after the March 1st movement in Korea was the May 4th movement. What many of you might not have realized is that China actually supported the Allies during World War I, mainly because they had hoped that the Allies, if they had won, which they did, would return some of their land that had been taken by the Germans. What makes things kind of sticky was that Japan also wanted that land. In the end, the Allies sided with Japan on this. So enter the May 4th movement that occurred in 1919. Loads of Chinese citizens took to the streets in protest, where a large anti-Japanese message was demonstrated. So guys, the most important thing you need to note that came out of this for China is that this would end up causing a large rejection of Western democracy and ideals, mainly because they probably felt like they had been stabbed in the back. And this would lead to an increase in support for communism. So enter in Mao Zedong, leader of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, who took a lot of inspiration from the Russian Revolution. The difference between what happened in Russia, though, is that Mao Zedong believed communism would only be successful in China through support from the peasantry, so the peasant class, whereas the Russians garnered support from the working class. Mao Zedong and the CCP were up against the Chinese National Party, which wanted to industrialize China as well as gain independence for China. They did actually work together to gain independence for China. However, The leader of the Nationalist Party is going to die and another is going to take over. This new leader of the Nationalist Party was very intolerant of the CCP and attacked Mao Zedong in 1927, which led to the Chinese Civil War. So, some examples of negotiated independence is going to be India from the British Empire. So, this can actually be traced back to 1857 with the First War of Independence, which was caused by ongoing British disregard for Indian society. You should probably know the formation of the Indian National Congress for sure. This new push happened after World War I, led by Gandhi, Nehru, and others. More pressure is going to be added after World War II with the creation of Quit India movement. It would become clear that British control over India is going to be impossible. So in July 1947, the British Parliament passed the Indian Independence Act, which gave India its independence. The Gold Coast, and also before we go to the Gold Coast, what you need to know is that in 1947, you're going to have Indian independence, but you're also going to have the establishment of Pakistan. So Pakistan is going to be carved out of India and become its own country, mainly for the Muslim population. And the Hindu population is going to reside in India. All right, so the Gold Coast from the British Empire, the Europeans that had colonized this area had been educating Africans in this region. So they had a European education. So once Africans were exposed to ideas like natural rights and labor rights, things like that, they wanted those things. Now known as Ghana, they would gain their independence from the British in 1957, so just 10 years after India would gain its independence. The country would be the first to transform into a republic with a president who is appointed for life. So don't get that confused. Just because a country labels itself as a republic doesn't actually mean that they follow a democracy. So don't get that confused. So actually, Ghana was going to be the first country to gain independence from European colonialism in Africa. So our reasoning process here, continuity and change over time. What international circumstances and social changes contributed to the end of colonial empires? So according to your Strayer, the increasingly democratic values of European states ran counter to the essential dictatorship of colonial rule. The ideal of national self-determination was profoundly at odds with the possession of colonies that were denied any opportunity to express their own national character. The enormously powerful force of nationalism, having earlier driven the process of European empire building, now played a major role in its disintegration. Colonial rule, in this argument, dug its own grave. In explaining the timing of the end of empire, historians frequently use the notion of conjuncture, the coming together of several separate developments at a particular time. At the international level, the world wars had weakened Europe while discrediting any sense of European moral superiority. Both the US and the Soviet Union, the new global superpowers, generally opposed the older European colonial empires, even as they created empire-like international relationships of their own. Meanwhile, the United Nations provided a prestigious platform from which to conduct anti-colonial agitation. All of this contributed to the global illegitimacy of empire, a novel and stunning transformation of social values that was enormously encouraging to Africans and Asians seeking political independence. So that wraps up 7.5.